Hello, I'm Joseph Dillard, and welcome to Integral Deep Listening. How do we know if IDL works? How can we tell if something is truly useful and valuable, or only a siren's call that entices us to our own self-destruction? For that matter, how do we know if anything is true or false? Any dream yoga that is worthy of the name has to take the findings of consensus empirical research into account. That is, our understandings of dreams and dreaming cannot be based simply on the authority of Scripture and our own mystical experiences, but must also be based on objective data provided by empirical consensus. Otherwise, our lives are based on our beliefs rather than on knowledge or wisdom. That's a shaky foundation on which to build a life. Traditional formulations of dreams and dreaming, including symbolic, shamanic, lucidity, and deity yoga approaches, assume that ancient authorities and interior personal experience are correct and that science will someday catch up to these realizations. This is reminiscent of the arguments for intelligent design and creationism, which continually wage a losing battle with the ongoing discoveries of evolutionary science. None of us want to put ourselves in a similar position where we someday look back on our lives and realize we spent them fighting for a worldview or belief system that doesn't correspond to quickly expanding clarifications of the nature of humanity and life itself. Submitting personal intuition, knowingness, and revelation to the court of eclectic or consensus opinion is something hardcore true believers can have a very hard time accepting. Mystical revelations and the reality of personal experience can be so evidential that it is easy to convince ourselves that the perspectives of science have to be wrong if they conflict with our sacred belief systems. In fact, it is often true that science is overturned and that world culture is basically a state of collective delusion. But that includes our belief systems as well. It doesn't mean that our own truth is more trustworthy. We see that dilemma work its way out in the conflicts children often have with the authority of their parents. Adolescents often go through a stage where they are certain they know better than their parents, only to find out, often years later, and the hard way, that their parents knew more than they gave them credit for. Santayana's famous quote, "Those who do not learn from the past are destined to repeat it," reminds us of this perennial truth. So, how do we find out what is true? IDL relies on a process called triangulation, which is explained elsewhere in this series of videos. IDL, as a dream yoga, accepts the validity of the three strands of empiricism. First, the setting out of instructions or injunctions as a path, yoga, or recipe to follow. Second, actually following the injunctions, performing the experiment, or doing the yoga. 3, submitting our results to the judgment of those skilled in the skill, academic, discipline, or yoga. For example, in order to have your theory of physics accepted, you first have to learn physics. Then you have to do an experiment, and then write it up and submit it to a scientific journal to be reviewed by your peers, those that understand physics. Submitting it to your garden club doesn't count, unless those members happen to be physicists knowledgeable in your particular subspecialty. If Einstein had to do this, you and I have to do this too. We don't have to learn physics, but we have to follow these three strands to be credible in whatever yoga we undertake. Just as there are three strands of empiricism, there are three levels of empiricism: physical, cognitive, and transpersonal. Physical empiricism involves doing actual research with matter or energy in some way that can be measured or objectified by others. For example, Eratosthenes in 240 BC measured the angle of the sun on a wall in Alexandria and use geometry to very closely calculate the circumference of Earth. Cognitive empiricism, the second type, involves generating theories that are subjected to collective standards of logic, rationality, and professional norms. Einstein's research publications are examples of cognitive empiricism. Note that cognitive empiricism assumes and includes physical empiricism. Einstein had to do thought experiments that were subject to actual measurements in the physical world in order for his theories to be accepted as valid. Transpersonal empiricism is more than mystical revelation. Any claim of transpersonal truth is subject to both physical and cognitive empiricism. Following Wilber's pre-post fallacy, transpersonal claims have to meet criteria of both in order to be considered valid. Obviously, this is a very high bar, and while almost all those who make transpersonal, spiritual, metaphysical claims believe that they meet these standards, on closer examination they generally rely on a combination of authority, personal, mystical, or meditative experience, and a freewheeling interpretation of science that concludes it validates their particular beliefs. A notable example is Psychism. The reason why psychic phenomena have not been widely accepted by the scientific community is that experiences of telepathy, clairvoyance, and psychokinesis are notoriously difficult to duplicate. Carl Sagan has famously summarized this understanding as, quote, "Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence." This is true as well for Integral Deep Listening's claim to be a transpersonal yoga. And in subsequent videos, we will discuss its methodology and how it can be empirically tested to determine if it really is a transpersonal dream yoga. True believers don't like this model. They want to define truth, and truth with capital letters, based on the validating experience of the transpersonal. They don't want to have it to ground it in physical and cognitive empiricism. Do you? If you do, IDL is for you. If you don't, well, there are a lot of other approaches out there that will agree with you. Do you have questions or comments? Let us know how we can help by sharing your interests in the section below this video or at Friends of IDL on Facebook. You will find more information on Dream Yogas at dreamyoga.com and more on IDL interviewing at integraldeeplistening.com. For those who want a deeper dive, there are texts on Integral Deep Listening at the URL below. Thanks for watching. See you next time.